Blood. Not just a trickle, not just a suggestion, but vivid crimson, technicolor blood splashed across the screen like nothing audiences had ever seen before. In 1958, Hammer Film Productions did something revolutionary. They brought Dracula back from the dead, but this time he wasn't lurking in shadows. He was bursting into color, dripping with gothic romance, and more dangerous than ever. Christopher Lee's eyes burned red, Peter Cushing wielded stakes like weapons, and suddenly vampire movies would never be the same again. This wasn't your grandfather's Dracula. This was Horror of Dracula, and it changed everything. Before we sink our teeth into these bloodthirsty facts, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We're diving deep into Gothic castles, censorship battles, and the secrets behind one of horror's most iconic films. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happened behind the scenes. From Christopher Lee's painful contact lenses to the chocolate syrup blood that looked better than the real thing, we've got 16 facts that'll make you see this classic in a whole new light. Alright, let's get into it. Number 1. Christopher Lee only had 13 lines of dialogue. For a character who would define an entire generation of vampire films, Dracula barely spoke. Christopher Lee delivered exactly 13 lines in the entire movie. 13. That's less dialogue than most supporting characters get in a single scene. But here's the genius. He didn't need words. Every movement was calculated. Every glare was a threat. Every step toward his victim dripped with predatory grace. Lee brought a physicality to Dracula that made language obsolete. His towering 6'5" frame, those burning eyes, the way he moved like a panther stalking prey. Silence became his most terrifying weapon. Where Bela Lugosi's Dracula seduced with words, Lee's Dracula simply took what he wanted. No monologues, no explanations, just raw primal danger. That restraint turned Dracula into something more than a villain. He became a force of nature, and it proved something Hollywood would remember for decades. Sometimes the most powerful performances are the ones that say the least. Number 2. The film was shot in only 25 days. Modern blockbusters spend months in production. Some spend years. Horror of Dracula. Director Terence Fisher had exactly 25 days to capture immortality on film. That's less than a month to shoot an entire movie that would launch a franchise spanning 2 decades. Every scene had to be perfect on the first or second take. There was no time for experimentation, no budget for elaborate do-overs. Fisher ran a tight ship, blocking multiple scenes in advance, using the same elaborate Gothic sets over and over, just redressed with different props and lighting. The crew worked 6-day weeks. The actors memorized pages of script overnight, and somehow, impossibly, they pulled it off. That breakneck schedule gave the film an urgent, visceral energy. The stakes felt real because everyone on set was racing against the clock. You can feel it in every frame. The desperation, the intensity, the sense that everything could fall apart at any moment. 25 days to make history, and they didn't waste a single one. Number 3. Christopher Lee wore excruciating red contact lenses. Those iconic burning red eyes that haunted audiences. They came at a brutal price. Christopher Lee wore blood-red contact lenses during Dracula's most terrifying moments, and they were absolute agony. Made from hard plastic in the 1950s, these weren't the comfortable soft lenses we have today. They were rigid, scratchy discs that felt like shards of glass pressed against his eyeballs. Lee could only wear them for a few minutes at a time before his eyes would water uncontrollably and his vision would blur. Between takes, he'd have to remove them, let his eyes recover, then force them back in for the next shot. The pain was so intense that some of his most menacing expressions weren't acting at all. They were genuine discomfort mixed with barely controlled fury, but that suffering translated into something terrifyingly real on screen. Those weren't special effects. That was Christopher Lee, in actual pain, channeling it into pure predatory menace. Every time Dracula's eyes flashed red, you were watching an actor endure torture for his art, and somehow, that made the monster even more believable. Number 4. They used chocolate syrup for blood. Here's the dirty secret behind Horror of Dracula's revolutionary gore. That vivid crimson blood that shocked audiences in 1958? Chocolate syrup. The crew discovered early on that actual red-tinted liquids photographed terribly in Technicolor. They'd look too bright, too orange, almost cartoonish under the hot studio lights. So they turned to a trick borrowed from Hitchcock's Psycho, which would use the same technique 2 years later. Chocolate syrup on camera became deep, rich, arterial red. It had the right viscosity, the right darkness, the right way of catching light that made it look disturbingly real. They'd heat it slightly so it would flow better during staking scenes, making every vampire death look like a genuine hemorrhage. The irony, audiences were horrified by what they thought was groundbreaking special effects gore. Critics complained about the explicit violence, censors demanded cuts, but it was all just Hershey's syrup dripping down Christopher Lee's fangs and splattering across Peter Cushing's face. Sweet, innocent chocolate creating the most notorious blood and guts in cinema history. Number 5. Peter Cushing did his own stunts. While Christopher Lee brought aristocratic menace, Peter Cushing brought action hero intensity to Van Helsing, and he insisted on doing almost all of his own stunts despite being in his mid-40s and working on that punishing 25-day schedule. The elaborate fights, the leaping over furniture, the physical confrontations with vampires, that was all Cushing, refusing to let a stunt double diminish his performance. During the final showdown with Dracula, Cushing personally performed the famous scene where Van Helsing tears down curtains to flood the room with sunlight, then improvises a cross from candlesticks to hold the vampire at bay. Every jump, every roll, every desperate scramble was him. The crew worried constantly that he'd get injured, but Cushing was relentless. His commitment transformed Van Helsing from a doddering old professor into cinema's first vampire action hero. He made vampire hunting look brutal, exhausting, and desperate. You believed he was fighting for his life because physically, he actually was. No safety wires, no CGI, just a middle-aged British actor throwing himself around a soundstage like his life depended on it. Number 6. The censors tried to destroy the film. The British Board of Film Censors saw Horror of Dracula and panicked. They'd never encountered anything like it. The explicit violence, the sexual undertones, the way vampire bites looked disturbingly intimate. They demanded massive cuts before they'd grant certification. But Hammer Films and Terence Fisher fought back. The most controversial scene? The staking of the vampire woman in the crypt. The censors called it pornographic, claiming the way she writhed and gasped made it look like something else entirely. They wanted it cut completely. Hammer compromised, trimming seconds here and there, but refusing to gut the scene entirely. They knew that scene was the film's calling card. Even after cuts, the controversy exploded. Churches condemned it. Parental groups protested. Some theaters refused to show it. But every bit of outrage translated into box office gold. Lines wrapped around blocks. Late-night screenings sold out instantly. The censors tried to kill Horror of Dracula, but instead, they made it infamous. And infamous meant unstoppable. Number 7. The castle sets were recycled over and over. That gothic masterpiece of a castle where Dracula lurked, those elaborate corridors, crypts, and libraries that felt so authentic. They were built at Bray Studios on a shoestring budget, then used again and again and again for nearly every Hammer horror film for the next 15 years. The same archways appeared in Curse of Frankenstein. The same stone staircases showed up in Curse of the Werewolf. The same crypts were redressed for Plague of the Zombies. The crew became masters of reinvention, changing tapestries, rearranging furniture, adjusting lighting to make the same physical space look like completely different locations. It was cinematic sleight of hand at its finest. Those sets became as iconic as the monsters themselves. They were Hammer's secret weapon, allowing them to create big-budget atmosphere on B-movie budgets. Every cobweb, every torch sconce, every stone archway was used until it literally fell apart, and audiences never noticed they were watching the same castle over and over because the magic worked. Those recycled sets weren't cutting corners. They were building a gothic universe. Number 8. It made more money than anyone expected. Hammer Films hoped Horror of Dracula would turn a modest profit, maybe recoup its £81,000 budget and earn enough for a sequel. Instead, it exploded. The film earned back its entire budget within weeks of release in the UK alone. When it hit America as Horror of Dracula to distinguish it from the Bela Lugosi version, it became a box office phenomenon. Drive-ins couldn't book it fast enough. Teenagers packed theaters for multiple showings. The film eventually grossed over £2 million worldwide, a staggering return that made it one of the most profitable British films of 1958. That success changed Hammer's entire trajectory. Suddenly, they weren't a small studio gambling on horror. They were the new kings of Gothic terror. That financial windfall launched a dynasty. 9 more Dracula films with Christopher Lee, countless Frankenstein sequels, an entire Hammer horror brand that would define the genre for 2 decades. All because this little color vampire movie that was supposed to be a modest gamble became a goldmine that nobody saw coming. Still here? Good. Because we're about to dive into the behind-the-scenes chaos that almost destroyed the movie, the shocking inspiration behind Dracula's death scene, and the reason Christopher Lee eventually grew to hate the role that made him a legend. But first, if you're loving these gothic secrets, smash that like button. It helps the algorithm gods smile upon us. And trust me, you want to see what's coming next. Alright, back to the blood and fangs. Number 9. The disintegration scene was created with makeup and colored dust. That iconic ending where Dracula ages centuries in seconds, then crumbles to dust in the sunlight? It's one of the most famous death scenes in horror history, and it was achieved with nothing but makeup, colored powder, and Phil Leakey's genius as special effects artist. No CGI, no optical effects, just practical movie magic. Christopher Lee sat in the makeup chair for hours as Leakey applied layers of aging prosthetics to his face. Then, in reverse photography, they filmed Lee with the old-age makeup on first, slowly removing layers while blowing red and gray powder across his face to simulate decomposition. When played backward and sped up, it looked like Dracula was rapidly aging and disintegrating. The effect was so convincing that it traumatized children and amazed adults. Critics called it groundbreaking. It became the template for vampire deaths for decades afterward. And it proved that sometimes the most memorable movie magic doesn't come from expensive technology. It comes from a skilled artist, some colored dust, and the willingness to film something weird and trust that it'll work in reverse. Number 10. Christopher Lee eventually hated playing Dracula. The role made him a star. The role made him wealthy. The role made him immortal in cinema history. And Christopher Lee came to absolutely despise it. By the third or fourth Dracula sequel, Lee was openly complaining that the character had no depth, no dialogue, and no development. He was just a hissing monster in a cape. He tried to quit multiple times, but Hammer kept offering more money, and Lee kept returning. By the 1970s, he was sleepwalking through roles in films like Dracula AD 1972 and The Satanic Rites of Dracula, visibly bored and resentful. In interviews, he'd call some of the later films rubbish and admit he only did them for the paycheck. The tragedy: Lee was a classically trained actor who spoke multiple languages, sang opera, and wanted to play complex Shakespearean roles. Instead, he was forever typecast as the silent vampire from a film he made in 25 days when he was 36 years old. The role that should have been his greatest triumph became his elegant prison, and he wore that cape like chains for the rest of his career. Number 11. The film had no Renfield character. Every Dracula adaptation before Horror of Dracula included Renfield, the insane servant who eats insects and worships the vampire. He's in Stoker's novel. He's in the Lugosi film. He's practically tradition. But screenwriter Jimmy Sangster cut him entirely, and the movie didn't miss him for a second. Sangster streamlined everything. He stripped away subplots, condensed characters, and focused the entire story on the primal confrontation between Dracula and Van Helsing. Good versus evil, hunter versus hunted. No distractions, no comic relief, just pure gothic dread building toward an inevitable showdown. That bold decision made the film leaner, meaner, and more intense than any vampire movie before it. There was no buffer between the audience and the horror, no quirky side character to release tension. Just Dracula, silent and lethal, stalking through corridors while Van Helsing raced to stop him. Sangster proved that sometimes respecting the source material means knowing exactly what to throw away. Number 12. The title was changed for American audiences. In the UK, the film was simply called Dracula. Clean, classic, straightforward. But when it crossed the Atlantic to American theaters, distributors panicked. Universal still owned the rights to the 1931 Dracula title for theatrical re-releases, and they didn't want audiences confused about which vampire movie they were seeing. So the American distributors slapped Horror of in front of the title, creating Horror of Dracula. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't elegant, but it worked. The new title screamed from marquees, warning audiences that this wasn't their parents' black and white vampire. This was something bloodier, something more explicit, something that promised genuine horror. That awkward retitling actually helped the film's legacy. Horror of Dracula became its own brand, instantly distinguishing Hammer's visceral Technicolor nightmare from Universal's atmospheric classic. The title that was meant to avoid confusion became iconic in its own right. Sometimes the best marketing decisions are the ones made out of pure legal necessity. Number 13. Jimmy Sangster wrote the script in 2 weeks. While the film took 25 days to shoot, screenwriter Jimmy Sangster had even less time to write it. Hammer wanted a Dracula script fast, and Sangster delivered in roughly 2 weeks, pounding out pages between other projects and practically improvising the structure as he went. He didn't have time for elaborate backstory or complex character development, so he created something brutally efficient. Jonathan Harker arrives at the castle already knowing Dracula is a vampire, on a mission to destroy him. No slow build, no mystery. The audience hits the ground running from minute 1, and the tension never stops. That breakneck writing schedule accidentally created perfect horror pacing. Every scene advanced the plot. Every conversation mattered. There was no fat, no filler, no wasted moments. Sangster's script moved like a freight train because he literally didn't have time to write anything else, and that desperate, urgent storytelling became Hammer's signature style for years to come. Number 14. Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee became lifelong friends. Before Horror of Dracula, Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee barely knew each other. They'd worked together once before on Hammer's Curse of Frankenstein, but hadn't bonded. That changed during those intense 25 days at Bray Studios. Thrown together in elaborate costumes, working punishing hours, and creating cinema history, they forged a friendship that would last until Cushing's death in 1994. They'd go on to make 22 films together over 4 decades. They'd vacation together, support each other through personal tragedies, and remain each other's closest confidants in an industry that chewed up friendships. When Cushing's beloved wife died in 1971, Lee was one of the few people who could console him. Their on-screen chemistry as vampire and vampire hunter wasn't acting. It was genuine respect, affection, and the kind of trust that only comes from creating something special together. Every time they faced off on screen, you were watching two best friends who understood each other perfectly, locked in an eternal dance between darkness and light. Number 15. The film influenced every vampire movie that followed. Before Horror of Dracula, vampires were elegant, mysterious aristocrats who spoke in formal English and recoiled from crosses. After Horror of Dracula, they were predators, dangerous, sexual, physical threats who could tear you apart as easily as seduce you. Lee's Dracula didn't ask permission, he took. That shift echoed through cinema for decades. From Blackula to Interview with the Vampire to Blade to Let the Right One In, every vampire film owes something to Hammer's template. The idea that vampires could be simultaneously attractive and terrifying, that vampire hunting required physical courage, that blood could be shown explicitly rather than suggested, all of that started here. Even modern vampire franchises like Twilight and The Vampire Diaries, which romanticized vampires to the extreme, were building on Hammer's foundation of making vampires dangerously seductive. Horror of Dracula didn't just restart the vampire genre, it rewrote the rules entirely, proving that old monsters could become new nightmares with just a splash of color and the right actor's burning eyes. Number 16. Christopher Lee. Never watched the film with an audience, despite spending 2 decades playing Dracula across 9 films. Despite the role defining his entire career, Christopher Lee claimed he never once sat in a theater and watched Horror of Dracula with a paying audience. He attended premieres, of course, and screenings for cast and crew, but he never experienced the film the way millions of fans did, surrounded by strangers in the dark. Lee admitted in later interviews that he found watching himself on screen uncomfortable, almost unbearable. He'd see every mistake, every moment where he could have done something differently, every flaw that audiences overlooked, so he avoided it. He'd do the work, collect the paycheck, and move on to the next role without looking back. There's something haunting about that. The man who created the most iconic Dracula of all time never experienced the terror he inflicted on audiences, never heard the screams, never felt the collective dread when those red eyes first appeared. He gave us nightmares for generations, but he never witnessed the fear himself, in a way that makes him even more like Dracula. Immortal, powerful, and forever separate from the mere mortals he haunted. Horror of Dracula wasn't the first vampire movie, and it certainly wasn't the last, but it was the one that changed everything. It proved that gothic horror could be visceral and elegant, bloody and beautiful, terrifying and seductive all at once. It took 25 days, 81,000 pounds, chocolate syrup, and 2 actors who would become legends, and created something that still has fangs 65 years later. So which fact shocked you the most? Did you know Christopher Lee hated the role? Were you surprised the blood was chocolate? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more classic horror deep dives, from the monster movies that built Hollywood to the behind-the-scenes chaos of your favorite creature features, hit that subscribe button, because these old films have secrets worth digging up, and trust me, we're just getting started.